Good afternoon, everybody from the East Coast. If you're on the West Coast, good morning. My name is Jennifer Fagenfry. I am the NOAA Institutional Repository Manager, and I am here today with my colleague, Katie Rowley, who is our Outreach Librarian, and we are going to be your host today for our January installment of the Publishing at NOAA series. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start. If you have any questions, please be sure to use the question panel or the chat. Myself and Katie will be monitoring these throughout the session. As always, we are recording this session and it will be posted on the Central Library's YouTube channel at a later date, usually within about 24 hours is our hope to get it up there for you. So this month in the Publishing at NOAA series, we are looking at scientific integrity and fundamental research communications within NOAA. And we are very excited to have our guest speaker, Dr. Cynthia Decker, the Scientific Integrity Officer for NOAA. She adjudicates allegations of scientific misconduct, develops training, and works with the Deputy Undersecretary's Office and the NOAA Science Council to consider all the ways in which scientific integrity is woven into NOAA's work. In addition, Dr. Decker serves as the Executive Director for the NOAA Science Advisory Board. So at this time, I want to leave a lot of time for Cynthia and to ensure that we have time for questions at the end of the presentation for her. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Cynthia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and good afternoon and good morning to folks who might be on the West Coast or even further. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the library for having me. I'm happy to give you some background and information on scientific integrity and how it impacts fundamental research communications in NOAA. Next slide. So this slide is just an overview of the talk, so I'm not going to leave it up there very long. It's just to give you a quick understanding of the kinds of things that are going to be covered in this talk. Next slide. I'm going to start by saying that scientific integrity and fundamental research communications are governed by a policy and legal framework. And basically, it's what I call two policies and a law. There is the NOAA Administrative Order on Scientific Integrity, which is one policy. The second policy is the Department of Commerce Administrative Order on Public Communications. Both of these were created or revised from older policies in about the same time frame, 2010, 2011. Both were developed to address communications, and they have similar language about free flow of information in them. They both were revised, I think, in response to a presidential memorandum about scientific integrity that came out in 2009, and Office of Science and Technology policy memo that responded to that came out in 2010, which we call the Holdren memo. So those are the two policies. The law is the Information or Data Quality Act, which predates the two policies, but also governs the use and the publication of scientific information in the government. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to just cover all of those policies and try to show you how they all knit together, and then in the end bring you back to the fundamental research communications guidelines that NOAA has. So certainly here's the NAO. I'm pretty comfortable talking about this because I work with it all the time. Its purpose is to strengthen confidence in everyone, scientists, decision makers, the public, in the quality, validity, and reliability of NOAA science. And it also underscores the agency's commitment and support for its science and its scientists. Next slide. So the policy covers, this is the scope. It covers NOAA employees. It also covers contractors, partners, cooperative institute employees, grantees, basically anybody who gets a financial assistance award from NOAA. Next slide. So this is just a reminder of what constitutes misconduct under the NAO. These are the things that we commonly get allegations about. Fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, or what I think of as kind of the routine things that people think of when they think of research misconduct. Our policy also adds interference, which was explicitly requested under the Holdren memo. So interference can be a lot of things. It can be interference by a political appointee or a career person. It may be suppression or distortion of science or actual interference with scientists getting their work done or publishing their work. So that's what we're covering under the interference definition. And all of these things may involve fundamental research communications. The FFP may be with respect to publications. In the end, the Scientific Integrity Office is concerned with correcting the record. So that often involves retracting or revising publications or data sets of different kinds. Next slide. So scientific integrity and fundamental research communications can also involve, this gets us back to that language on the free flow of information. There's this is sort of a little summary of some of the things that are broadly covered in the NAO. The NAO states that we do encourage publication of data and results, but they do require internal review. We also encourage communication of all of the results with the media and the public, but under no circumstance may any NOAA official ask or direct NOAA scientists or other employees to suppress or alter scientific findings, and that goes back to that interference definition. And finally, NOAA ensures the free flow of information by maintaining the integrity and traceability of its data. Next slide. What I'd like to go into now is to talk with you about the DAO on public communications. And the DAO, waiting for the next slide. DAO is on public communications. And so it establishes the policy in the department for employees that engage in any kind of communications. And this can range from publications to speeches to media coverage and all kinds of things. And I'll get into that. Now, the public communications DAO basically defines all the different kinds of communications that the department and its bureaus engage in, and then defines them all, and then talks about how they should be handled. And it does break out fundamental research communications as a separate type of communications, but I'm going to walk you through all of them so that you understand the context for FRCs. Next slide. The first one is public communications, and that is the umbrella term. I'm just going to grab a little bit of water. That's the umbrella term for all communications that are likely to be distributed outside the federal government and to the public. So it's everything from press releases to public education materials to audiovisual materials such as PowerPoints or videos, and it also covers FRCs. Next slide. The next one is official communications. These are the communications that are put out to the public outside the federal government, but these are the ones that largely cover things like management, policy, and budget issues. So they're not about research, they're largely about the way that the department and its bureaus operate and that aspect of communications. It does have a clause in there about the protection of science, and states that if the publication involves science and the Office of Communications is working with a publication that involves science, it has to be sure that the scientist approves of what it's doing, approves of what the communication says, and they're really only responsible for the presentation, the logistics, and that sort of aspect of the communication, but that the science always goes back to the scientist. Next. And finally, here's our fundamental research communications. It defines these pretty clearly, but it also says that if it's a communication that includes policy, budget, or management, then by definition, it is not a fundamental research communication, and it's pretty clear about that. And this requires internal review, but not review by the Office of Communications. Next. This is the last category. It's called non-official communications. These are likely to involve communications that a scientist might make that are not done on her official duty, not done at the direction of her supervisor, not done with government resources, but may involve her research. So think of something like giving a talk to your daughter's high school class about your science. You know, say you're a specialist in harmful algal blooms, or you're a specialist in hurricanes, and you want to give a talk to your daughter's class about this topic. That may be what you do for a living at NOAA. So the suggestion here is that it's probably wise to have it reviewed internally. Perhaps give it to your supervisor and say, hey, this is what I'm going to present. You know what my research is, but I'm not going to be saying anything about NOAA. I'm not going to be doing this as a NOAA employee, but they suggest it's probably wise to have it given a quick review. It also covers a category of communications that you might make as a federal employee that has nothing to do with your work. So let's say you are an expert in growing roses, or you are an expert in some aspect of history, like the history of your local town, or the Civil War, or you are a quilter and you want to talk to a group about that. You're a federal employee, but you can certainly talk about matters that have nothing to do with your work and they don't require internal review. So that this policy also makes that clear. So next. That pretty much covers all of the DAO. The final piece of documentation is the Information Quality Act, or the Data Quality Act. I am not an expert in IQA, so if you have a lot of questions about IQA, I can either punt them to someone else, or just get back to you about these essentially. So this is just a real quick and dirty covering of the IQA. It requires OMB and the agencies to issue information quality guidelines, and they're looking particularly at quality, objectivity, utility, and integrity of the information. It also requires them to conduct a pre-dissemination review of information products to ensure that it's developed, created, and pre-reviewed with those quality standards in mind. It establishes administrative mechanisms for people to request correction of information that doesn't meet those qualifications, and of course, an annual report to OMB. Next slide. NOAA categorizes all of the IQA information into, it bins them into several categories. I believe there's 7 of them, and these pretty much cover everything that NOAA does. It's got its synthesis products, data, forecasts and advisories, natural resource plans like fishery management plans, experimental products, and then corporate and general information. It establishes, I noted earlier that it establishes the guidelines for the research that's being communicated. And there are a couple of categories of communication that you may have heard of. There's influential scientific information or highly influential scientific assessments, ISA and HISA. And those are the things that most people hear about, because there have to be, once those publications are reviewed under those criteria to see if they are ISAs or HISAs. And if they are, then they have to go through a particular, they have to be sure that they go through a particular kind of review. Often for things like research articles that are going into a journal, the peer review that the journal gives them can stand as the peer review required under IQA. I probably misstated some things under this, but if you have questions again about IQA, I'm happy to take them and get them to somebody who is much more knowledgeable than I am. Next slide. And now we come to the framework guidelines, the framework for internal review and approval of fundamental research communications. This is the policy that has evolved out of my 2 policies and a law. So it was developed in response to DAO language that said that bureaus could develop their own guidance for FRCs, and NAO language that in fact required NOAA to develop a guidelines for FRCs. Next slide. Oh, and IQA. Sorry, that's at the bottom. It also responds to IQA requirements as well, and that's explicitly stated in the guidelines. It was developed. The scope of the guidelines. It applies to all the NOAA line and staff offices, and it applies to all NOAA authors and co-authors, as well as NOAA contractors, regardless of the order of authorship. And I highlighted that because that's an important point. You have to get these documents reviewed, your FRCs reviewed, regardless of whether you're the first author, so it's the research you do and it is you are the person, or if you are the 5th author, or if you're the 10th author. So if you've got 9 academics and then the 10th author is a NOAA employee, that document still has to go through internal review because of the NOAA employee. Although I would say if you're the 10th author, you need to think about whether or not there should even be authorship. And I would say that probably what happens with that kind of internal review is it will look at like the little piece that you've got as the 10th author on that paper. But nevertheless, if you're an author on that paper, it has to go through internal review in the agency. And it applies to all fundamental research communications as they are defined in the department administrative order. Next, please. These guidelines provide the minimum requirements for internal review for all the LOs and staff offices regarding the publication. And these are the criteria listed here as they are in the guidelines. They have to be reviewed by the author's head of the operating unit or a designee. It must use a disclaimer if appropriate. Oops, I skipped a couple. It meets the definition of an FRC that's in the DAO. It's appropriate for the intended audience. It uses a disclaimer as if appropriate. It's reviewed for inconsistencies. Basically, they want you to, basically it says, look at that and make sure that it's not just the quality of the science, but it's also like, were your methods good? Were your data good? Did you do everything appropriately? And if it's consistent with the NAO on scientific integrity, and if it meets the Information Quality Act standards. Next. So just a reminder that under the FRC guidelines, every line office has to have a process for internal review. So at this point, I believe all of the line offices have policies in place, and they vary in terms of how it's implemented, the level to which they're implemented, but there is a requirement for that. These are the things that you must not do in the review. It shouldn't prohibit NOAA scientists from freely expressing their opinions. It should be useful to be used to exhibit. It should not be used. I'm having a hard time reading this. It should not be used to inhibit or excessively delay the dissemination of the scientific information. So you can't slow roll the review in order to keep it from being published. No authors have the right to communicate as private citizens, subject to the DAO, the non-official communications of interest. And also it asks that the internal review not exceed 30 calendar days. If it's going to go longer than 30 calendar days, then the author has to be notified and there has to be some reason given. So it tries to put some bounds on the review process as well. Next slide. So just a little bit more about the disclaimer. The disclaimer is used when the scientific conclusions are presented in an FRC could be construed as representing the view of NOAA or the department when it is not. So the FRC guidelines provide some suggested language to use in that case. And then I put something in red, which I think is an important point. The disclaimer shouldn't be used as a way to avoid internal review or to avoid responding to internal review. I'd say probably 99.9% of the people going through internal review of their documents in NOAA have no issue. They may not like to be internally reviewed, but and you'll see a wide variety of opinion on that, but they go through it. There are cases though where there are individuals who either get some, feel like their research is maybe on the cutting edge and it's not appreciated, so they may not want to publish it, even though it's being done with government resources and government data and being done on their work time. Or they may feel that it goes through review and they don't like the suggestions they get for the review. So very occasionally these situations occur, and what has happened is the individual says, well, I'm just going to put a disclaimer on it and then I'm good. And the answer is, well, not really. So we try to discourage the use of the disclaimer, except in very specific circumstances. I sort of imagine the disclaimer would be used more frequently. So for example, when you're giving an oral presentation about your research and then somebody raises their hand and says, and what's the implication of this for NOAA policy on blah, blah? And you can use the disclaimer and say, well, I have an opinion on that, but it's my personal opinion and it's not the opinion of NOAA or the department or the government, but here's my personal opinion. Or what you can also do, and what we've counseled people to do, is to say, I'm not the expert on how that policy would apply, but I'm happy to find someone who can answer that question for you. So there are ways to handle this, but I wanted to make the point that the disclaimer isn't there for people to just put on their papers when they don't like the internal review. So next slide. So what I'm going to do now is sort of circle back from fundamental research communications back to the NOAA administrative order, because we just went through a review and revision of the NAO and the procedural handbook. So it was last, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the NAO was vintage 2011. It was responding to that memo from OSTP. So the language is about 9 years old. The procedural handbook, on the other hand, was just revised in 2017. So its language is a bit more current, a bit more up to date. The history behind the revision for the NAO, however, came out of a particular circumstance. You might remember back in 2019, Hurricane Dorian, there was a tweet from the president that said that basically said the hurricane might hit Alabama. In response to a sudden uptick in public communication to the Weather Forecast Office in Birmingham, that WFO put out a tweet that said, no, this hurricane is not going to hit Alabama. And that resulted in a bit of a kerfuffle between the White House and the Department of Commerce and NOAA, which ended in a NOAA communications memo being issued that made a statement about how the science behind the WFO and the way the WFO had handled that was not appropriate and didn't reflect the best science. That in turn led to 4 allegations of scientific misconduct for interference that were adjudicated. Since the respondent in that was the head of the agency, Neil Jacobs, the Scientific Integrity Office decided to send the adjudication for that outside the agency. So it was sent to the National Academy for Public Administration, NAPA, and they put together a team and reviewed all of the evidence and considered it, and then sent back their report with their recommendations to the determining official for those allegations. They were adjudicated all together. They were pulled together, all 4, and adjudicated as a group. So 1 report and 1 memo from the determining official that included recommendations that came from NAPA. And there was a couple of them that were for the NAO and the procedural handbook. The NAO, they thought that the language on the scientist's right of last review should be revised. And they also wanted the procedural handbook language to clarify what constitutes interference and to provide some examples. So for future inquiry or investigation teams benefit. So next. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just walk you through some of the changes that occurred in the NAO. The NAO was just signed off. I can't remember if I said this. It was signed off by Neil Jacobs on his last day in office on January 19th. It's now undergoing a bargaining unit review, and we'll see what comes out of that. But in the new NAO, as it stands now, there were some language changes that relate specifically to fundamental research communications. And the first one I've got up on the screen is the language that we modified that is about that scientist's right of last review. And I've highlighted the key language. Scientists who conduct the original work have the right to review and correct any official communication. That's because one of the arguments that was put forward in the investigation of the Dorian incident was that, well, a scientist had reviewed that communications memo. Neil Jacobs is a scientist and he reviewed it, so a scientist reviewed it. And NAPA felt the policy should be clarified to make it clear that the scientist who did the work should review, not just any scientist. And then finally, I didn't highlight it, but the last statement also says, also talks about NOAA will not release an official communication that relies on a scientist's original work if that scientist does not approve of how that work is described. And that's generally how the agency has been operating, but it's just stated pretty clearly in this NAO. Next slide. So the next couple of slides are about some language that went into 2 different places in the NAO. The first is in the Code of Scientific Conduct, which speaks to largely to scientists and sort of best practices for scientists. And one of the statements says they'll ensure research results receive appropriate peer review. And it also says that they will publish it in reputable journals or other public outlets and are not disseminated on preprint servers and in predatory journals. Predatory journals, of course, are journals that charge for publication. They're not necessarily legitimate. They may say they go through peer review, they put your article through peer review, but they may have, that may be not true. And they may have an editorial board that's bogus. There's variations on the predatory journal, but the bottom line is that they're doing this for money. They exist only as long as it makes money, and then they're usually online publications. So your paper gets up there, it's online, it looks like you've got this legitimate publication, but it's not really been peer reviewed, first of all. And secondly, if that journal decides to fold up its tent and go away, then the website shuts down and then your publication vanishes along with it. So you don't really have a publication that exists. Preprint servers are places where scientists put out new science, sort of to get it out to the community before it gets fully published and peer reviewed. Because we have a requirement for internal review and peer review, we don't generally permit our scientists to put things on preprint servers. They can be very useful. For example, under the recent pandemic, a lot of COVID research was being put up on preprint servers to get it out there as fast as possible so that people could look at it and then go back and do the full vetting and the full sending it to a journal and getting it peer reviewed and all of that. But preprint servers in those cases can serve a useful purpose. So next slide. This same language is reflected in the Code of Ethics for Supervisors and Managers that says that supervisors and managers won't allow these papers to be published on preprint servers and predatory journals. But it does also have language that says that there can be an exception to this prohibition, and it largely means an exception to the preprint server if there's particular circumstances that make that an important thing to do. So those are the main changes that were made to the NAO that involve fundamental research communications. We also updated it because the original NAO said NOAA will develop a policy framework for the review and approval of FRCs, and we've done that. So the language was updated to say this policy now exists, and all of the line offices have a policy that's implemented for internal review. So next. This is a slide that I put in that sort of gives us sort of the global picture of scientific misconduct. It notes this is based on a National Academy report that came out a few years ago that looked at scientific integrity, scientific misconduct, and noted some trends that probably will not be a huge surprise to people in the scientific world. Universities are producing more scientists, and it's difficult for the workforce to absorb them. For the research workforce to absorb them. There's a declining success rates for grants, and there's an increasingly reliance on external funds for faculty salaries if you're at a university. Again, government scientists aren't immune from this pressure. Certainly, government scientists also rely on publication records to help them get promotions, to help them get pay raises, all of those things that others do. Maybe they've got a job and maybe their job doesn't, or their salary doesn't depend on it, but they do get reviewed. You do get performance reviews, and certainly publications are a big part of that. But this results in a hyper-competitive research environment. And as I said, publishing is pretty critical to the success of both government and non-government scientists. Next slide. I'm just going to wind up now with some questions that I like to put that we ask in the Scientific Integrity Office, but they're also, we like to work in concert with the NOAA Central Library on these questions. And these, I've just thrown out a bunch of them that says, you know, if you've got questions about any of these things, you're welcome to contact me or to contact the library, and we'll see what we can do to help you. Certainly how the FRC guidelines are implemented, author designation or disputes. I mentioned the authorship issue earlier. The Scientific Integrity Committee has talked for a while about putting together a document on best authorship practices. We've not quite gotten it off the ground, but we felt that would be something that would be really helpful to scientists in the agency if we had something like that. In the meantime, the National Academy put out a report a few years ago on best authorship practices, and there's a website for an organization called COPE. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but they also deal with authorship best practices as well. Predatory journals, I mentioned those before. The library has quite a bit of expertise on these, and there's a place on their website where you can find out more information about predatory journals. They also support a subscription service called Cabals that tells you what predatory journals are. You can go in there and say, is this journal a predatory journal? And it's got a list of what they call, I think they used to call it the blacklist. I don't know if they still do, but it's a list of predatory journals. So you can look up a journal there if you get approached, because often those journals will approach you, the scientist. Peer review standards, which is an IQA thing, we can discuss that. I know the library's involved with that. And finally, communication guidelines. NOAA has some communication guidelines. The department has communication guidelines. So it's important to know what those are as well. Next slide, and this is basically my final slide. I've just listed some resources. There's a Scientific Integrity Commons website where you can find all of these documents that I've been talking about, the NAO, the DAO, link to IQA, and also some links to NOAA media guidance. I will say that the department also has a social media policy, which is seriously outdated and probably is in desperate need of being revised. Also, I put in a plug there for the scientific integrity training, which you can find on the Commerce Learning Center. So if you want to know more about this or just increase your knowledge about scientific integrity, you can go in. It's open to any NOAA employee. It's also open to any NIST employee, and we hope to work on getting it made available to contractors as well. So next slide. I'm just going to end on my favorite slide, which is scientific integrity policy in a seashell, which just lists sort of all major elements to our scientific integrity policy. But I am ready for questions now, if you have any. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. This is Katie, everyone. Before we get to questions, and while you guys are furiously typing, I want to do a little plug myself for the NOAA libraries. We have a survey going on right now. It closes tomorrow. So if you are a NOAA staff member or contractor, we would love for you to fill out that survey. We sent an email today, and we will probably send another one tomorrow. But if you have 11 minutes, the survey is vitally important to the NOAA libraries. And I will comment as well, Cynthia, that Cobbles does not call it the blacklist anymore. They call it predatory, I believe.
Good, good.
They have changed that.
I also see that Jen put in the chat box what COPE stands for. Thank you, Committee on Publication Ethics.
Yes.
And there's a lot of resources on that on their website.
Okay, so for our first question, for the disclaimer, the IQA documentation asks if a disclaimer is included. So it is a bit confusing when we see that we should be adding a disclaimer for the IQA side of things, but we are encouraged to use the disclaimer only periodically in the FRC guidelines. Can you clarify which takes precedence, IQA or FRC?
I actually don't have an answer to that because I'm not as familiar with the IQA policy and what the purposes of the disclaimer. I don't know if Tom Gleason is on the webinar, but Tom might be able to answer that question. Otherwise, I'm happy to go back and get an answer and send that back to you. So good question. I'm not very familiar with the IQA policy on disclaimers.
No problem, Cynthia. We will share the asker's email with you and you can respond offline to them.
Yeah.
Our next question is, would you be willing to share a copy of this presentation with the attendees today?
Oh, yeah, I think the library will have it. I mean, I'm happy to send it, but if the library has it and makes it available, then sure.
No problem. We can share that with everyone who attended today. Okay, are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any currently, but Jen, do you have anything you would like to add?
I don't directly related to this. I see a couple more that just popped into the question panel. So
great, I'll jump onto those questions then. Next question, Cynthia. We have used the preprint server BioRx in the past for papers to allow peer review feedback and to make it possible to cite a paper in another paper that's under review. For example, a methods paper that is cited in a research paper. Does the new preprint policy exclude these?
Well, the new preprint policy is brand spanking new. So we just added that language to the NAO. As I told you, the NAO just got signed. So we have yet to figure out the way to go with preprint servers. We did make sure, as I pointed out, to add that language that there can be exceptions. Exceptions can be made. Supervisors can make those exceptions. And I think that's for the kind of reason that you're suggesting. That's why we wanted to make sure there was something in there that said they could be used, but the circumstances would have to be reviewed and you'd have to get explicit permission. Having said that, I don't think that the prohibition against using preprint service is widely known in the agency yet. And so that's one of those things where we added it, and now we get to see what the fallout is and how we need to help develop good responses to that and establish what the exceptions would be. So good question. Thanks for bringing that up. We'll certainly make sure that we have that discussion.
Awesome, thank you. And our next question, okay. Thank you for this presentation. I just finished graduate school and I'm in the process of publishing my research. This work is independent related to fisheries, but it is independent of NOAA. Do these publications still need to be submitted for clearance? Am I able to list my NOAA affiliation in addition to the disclaimer?
You do not have, that does not have to be reviewed. That's considered a non-official communication. I mean, you might want to have somebody look at it to make sure, but it's your own research that was conducted prior to your time in the government. And so I think I don't think so. I'm sure the DAO defines that as the non-official communication of interest. So it's not necessarily required, but it's probably a good idea to have somebody take a quick look at it and make sure that there's nothing in there because the idea behind the whole policy is that you don't want to put something out there that could be construed as a government policy statement. So I'd say putting a disclaimer in there or something that says, you know, this was conducted when I was at the University of what's this. So.
Great, thank you, Cynthia.
Hope that's helpful.
Yes. What are criteria for press releases?
I don't know criteria for press releases in terms of whether you should or shouldn't do a press release or what the press release.
I'm assuming it's asking whether it's a official communication and needs to go through review. That's
so a press release would probably be generated by a communications office, so it would certainly be reviewed. If it contains science, like I know in OAR, our public affairs people put out press releases about particular groundbreaking science, but they always work with the scientists to make sure that the science is correctly interpreted. And we did a meeting with all the public communications folks a couple of years ago, and they all do this. You know, an instance where one office said, you know, we could not get the scientist to agree with the language we were using to describe his science. So in the end, we didn't put the press release out because in the end, the scientist has the right of last review. So is that helpful? Does that answer your question?
I will let the asker respond to that. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. Are abstracts included under NOAA policies? In other words, am I required to get internal review of abstracts I submit to give a talk at a meeting?
Yes, you are. It's a scientific product and it requires internal review. So yes, at the very least, your supervisor should review that and make sure it's good to go. Same with your presentation. I know a lot of people don't like that and feel very upset about that, but even your presentation at the meeting is supposed to go through internal review. And the different line offices have different policies, so you'd have to check with your line office to see how much of a review or how stringent a review things like abstracts and presentations have to go through. But yes.
And who, Cynthia, do you know who they should be talking to in their line office? Is there a specific person or group they should be asking?
I'm assuming there's a point of contact in each line office for the FRCs. I know, for example, in fisheries, it's Michael Liddell. I'm not sure who it is in the other line offices, but there should be a point of contact. And if you want, I can go back and find out who those are in all the line offices.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. Is there a recommended disclaimer for non-endorsements of products like instruments?
I'm sorry, say that again.
No problem. Is there a recommended disclaimer for non-endorsements of products like instruments?
A non-endorsement? Like if you don't want to endorse it, or you want to say this instrument is crap? Or do you mean an instrument? I'm going to talk about it, but I want to make it clear that this does not serve as an endorsement of this instrument. I'm assuming it's the latter.
I'm assuming that as well.
Yeah, I am too. I don't know if there is. I mean, I was doing scientific papers quite a while ago, but I remember that it didn't seem to be a problem if you said I used, the blah, 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 the something, something instrument to do this, and that no one necessarily construed that as an endorsement. But that's an interesting question. You could probably make up your own that says, nothing in here should be construed as an endorsement of the products, the products that are mentioned.
Thanks, Cynthia. Okay.
If you feel that you need to.
Gotcha. Next question. This is another one about affiliation and paper publication. I have a paper that I'm publishing that was done before I was at NOAA. They are a contractor, so they're wondering if they need to put their NOAA affiliation or the contractor information as their current institution.
Oh, that's a good point. I'm always a fan of more information rather than less information. So, I could imagine putting it forward with an asterisk by your name, saying, research done when this author was affiliated with, X contracting company. I would suggest something like that, but I don't think that specifically is covered under. Well, it depends on if the person was a contractor for NOAA. If you were doing the contract work for NOAA, then it's great to list that affiliation, but it would still have to go, the paper would still have to go through review. So, that if you're not putting it through internal review because you did it as a contractor, not for NOAA, then technically it doesn't have to go through internal review. But there's probably a way to footnote what your affiliation was at the time that the work was done.
Cynthia, do you mind if I jump in real quick? I know there's a
Sure.
section in the FRC that
Okay.
explicitly lists out how people are supposed to attribute their affiliation. It
yes,
breaks
that's
it
right.
out by the FTE, and then there is a section specifically for contractors. I think depending on the situation, your NOAA affiliation would come first in addition to the contractor affiliation, but I'm pretty certain, and I don't have it pulled up right in front of me, but I'm pretty certain it tells you in the FRC when you need to put your contractor affiliation first or when you can put the NOAA affiliation first, but that the contractor affiliation always has to be present, I believe.
Yeah,
I don't
and
remember
that's
the
my
exact
sense
language.
too. Great, thank you. So check the FRC guidelines. We've already covered it.
Awesome. Okay, our next question. Cynthia, are cooperative institutes supposed to go through the FRC process for their papers, or no? Do they go through their university?
I honestly am not sure the answer for that because technically you're not covered. Well, so the FRC guidelines say that it covers contractors, and I would imagine that it covers CI employees, particularly if they're doing the work at a NOAA lab. And this question has come up before, and I'm trying to remember how we answered it, but my feeling is that yes, you have to go through that review process, the same as you would if you were a contractor or an employee. It might address this in the FRC guidelines, but I'm not sure. But I can certainly get back to you.
Thanks, Cynthia. Last question that we have right now is, can you provide more examples of scientific integrity issues that were adjudicated?
In terms of interference, everything, I mean, we've gotten allegations of data fabrication, we've gotten allegations of plagiarism. Sorry, I've got a cat that's meowing next to me. He doesn't like it when I'm on video too long. We have not had, we don't generally put, describe our allegations and the resolution. We don't describe them in detail because we like to keep people anonymous, particularly if there was no finding of scientific misconduct. So we've not had a lot of allegations where there was actually a finding of scientific misconduct, but we certainly have had some. And our allegations have run the gamut of all of those, FFP or interference. So yeah, I'm loath to discuss specific examples because we like to keep people anonymous, and we don't have such a big library of allegations and resolutions that if I described anything specific to you, you wouldn't necessarily be able to figure out who it might be or where it happened.
Understood. Thank you. If no one has any, oh, we do have one more question. Are you seeing a particular rise in manipulation of images?
Ooh, yeah. We have not in NOAA, to my knowledge. I mean, if somebody's doing it, no one's caught it. That's something that we hear a lot about from NIH, quite honestly. And I took some training from NIH on scientific integrity, and they actually spent a lot of time on image manipulation, but I have not seen it in NOAA. So, good question.
No. Okay.
Doesn't mean it couldn't happen.
Yes, yes. If we don't have any questions, or if you are typing currently, I'm just going to give a quick plug. We will be having another Publishing at NOAA presentation in February on Friday the 12th. That'll be capping off our week of the NOAA Institutional Repository campaign, so be on the lookout for that. Jen, do you have anything you would like to add about our Publishing at NOAA series?
Yeah, I'll just say that the February session, I will be presenting along with Jeff Ray, who is our systems librarian. We will be discussing digital object identifiers. It's actually a two-part series. The first part, we will be talking about publication DOIs, and then in March, our NCEI colleagues will be discussing data DOIs and data set archiving with NCEI. So please join us for that. There should be some promo coming out in the next week or so.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. We've got kudos for you, Cynthia, for keeping up the good work. And
yeah, thanks to everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all the questions, but if you send me the questions, I'm certainly happy to follow up, or if the person who asked the question wants to send me an email directly, I'll get back to you with the answer.
Perfect. And this has been recorded and will be up on the library's YouTube channel shortly after we end this here. I believe that's all. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a lovely rest of your Thursday. Stay safe and healthy out there.
Thank you.